Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I would like to thank Yasmin and, of course, you, Frederick, and Michele for the wonderful opportunity. I'm afraid I've bitten off a little more than I can chew, so I'm just going to jump right into it and hope we don't run out of time. So that's the title of the talk, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to look at 10 slides. We're going to talk briefly about 2 metrics of translation, and then we're going to look at section 122 of the investigations and Hacker and Schulte's translation, and we're going to go through that bit by bit as it concerns the intertextualities. And
let me quickly share.
So let's just jump right into it. Here's some mottos in case anyone's interested. One from Alexander Pope: great wits sometimes may gloriously offend and rise to faults true critics dare not mend. And then a quote that I recently found from Kripke in a footnote to his book on rules in private language. Personally, I feel that the role of stylistic considerations here cannot be denied. It is clear that purely stylistic and literary considerations meant a great deal to Wittgenstein. His own stylistic preference obviously contributes to the difficulty of his work as well as to its beauty. And I'm going to try to show that the stylistic and the philosophical aren't mutually exclusive. I'm going to try to show how one informs the other and vice versa. So I guess before I start, there's 2 criticisms that I'd like to just get out of the way right from the very beginning. The first criticism of the entire enterprise here might be, well, intertextualities aren't important generally, right? In and of themselves, their absence proves nothing as far as a translation is concerned, and the burden of proof that they are relevant it has to be borne by the person who posits their relevance. And then the second objection is that rhetorical figures are at best important only stylistically, that they're irrelevant philosophically, and that translating philosophical texts need to make only one kind of sense, and that is philosophical sense, not stylistic sense. And anyone who wishes to say different bears the burden of proof. I'm going to try to bear both burdens of proof in this talk as best and as hopefully as clearly as I can. So the first response to the intertextuality bit is, if intertextualities need to be shown to be relevant in each individual case, and there's just a blanket denial of their relevance, then the first response is simply to advise that if there's a question of their relevance, then that question of relevance arises prior to any translation or prior to any criticism. You need to be able to address that during the translation phase. And if any translator comes to me and denies, gives me a blank denial of intertextualities and their relevance, as a translator, I'm going to have some doubt as to whether or not they've applied the appropriate level of care to their work. And as a translator, that's a really bad position to be in. No one likes to be in it as a translator. No one likes to have their diligence, as it were, questioned. And then the second way to answer that is just to try to meet that challenge, and I'm going to try to meet that challenge. As far as the rhetorical figures are concerned, here there's also 2 responses. The first is simply to advise that if rhetorical figures are irrelevant philosophically, then they can surely be translated without affecting the philosophy, right? So omitting them requires not silence, but explanation. And I think in this particular talk, since I'm going to be talking about Hacker and Schulte's translation, I think Hacker and Schulte are deafeningly silent on this point. And my second response is to just try to show how these rhetorical figures are relevant philosophically, and we're going to try to get into that. So, as a translator, there's 2 ways to, there's 2 metrics of any translation to judge whether a translation is in fact a good translation. And the first metric is completeness. I think the best way to think of completeness is as Adolf Loos's objects of use. They're complete in the sense that nothing present in the source text is omitted from the translation, and nothing absent from the source text is smuggled into the translation. Right? I think that's a pretty uncontroversial idea even for translators. The second metric is true or accuracy, right? Translation is true and complete, and true is just a fancy way of saying accurate. I don't know if there's any real consensus even in the industry what counts as accurate. I just think that most people, and myself included, you just argue for it. You say the translation isn't true, it's not accurate, and you try to make a case for why that might be. And the most obvious criteria that is always given, at least in my personal experience, is, well, surely a translation has to be grammatically correct. And I just always point out that not all writing, and in fact not all good writing, is grammatically correct. So we can't impose on the translation criteria that can't of necessity be imposed on the writing as well, the source writing itself. And if we take a look at, just to give you a brief idea of what I mean, I have two sentences from the preface to Philosophical Investigations where Wittgenstein uses the rhetorical figure of ellipsis. And you might be having some problems reading that in the back. I'll read it out loud. Nach manchen missglückten Versuchen, meine Ergebnisse zu einem solchen Ganzen zusammenzuschweißen, sah ich ein, dass mir dies nie gelingen würde. Dass das Beste, was ich schreiben könnte, immer nur philosophische Bemerkungen bleiben würde. Dass meine Gedanken bald erlahmten, wenn ich versuchte, sie gegen ihre natürliche Neigung in eine Richtung weiterzuzwingen. Anscombe translates this as, after several unsuccessful attempts to wield my results together into such a whole, I realized that I should never succeed, that the best I could write would never be more than philosophical remarks. My thoughts were soon crippled if I tried to force them on in any single direction against their natural inclination. Just a quick side note, I don't go into the Hacker and Schulte translation because they seem to be relying on an earlier translation from the Frühfassung of the investigations in theirs. And I think that's questionable in and of itself, but there's no reason that we have to get into that. The same point can be illustrated just by using Anscombe's translation. And I think that if you see the rhetorical figure here of ellipsis, ellipsis is where one sentence, where something is omitted for stylistic effect. And in English, if you take Anscombe's translation and translate this for rhetorical accuracy, you get something like this. After several unsuccessful attempts to weld my thoughts together into such a whole, I realized that I should never succeed. That the best I could write would never be more than philosophical remarks, that my thoughts were soon crippled if I tried, against their natural inclination, to force them on in any single direction. And I think there's a flow there that's rhetorically identifiable and for definite effect, right? He's trying to get the reader to slow down. And I also think it sounds better, but that might just be me personally. Whatever one may think of it, I think the fact of the matter remains that Anscombe and Hacker and Schulte, by extension, have mended the text in some ways. They've normalized the English text, and they've eradicated the rhetorical figure of ellipsis. So what does this mean generally for the investigations? Let's take a look at, this is section 122. All of the red stuff all the words that are marked in red are the ones that I'm going to be talking about, and these are Übersehen, Übersichtlichkeit, übersichtlich. There's two pairs of das. There's one pair of das wir, so two das wir und das wir. Das wir den Gebrauch unserer Wörter und dass wir die Zusammenhänge sehen. Then we have the word eben. That pops up here, and we're going to be talking about that. There's an interesting intertextuality there. There's two des Erfindens und des Erfindens, and we're going to be talking a little bit about why there's two of those there that are omitted in both the Anscombe and in the Hacker and Schulte translation. We'll be talking about Zwischenglieder, and then Darstellung, Darstellungsform, and then this little bit at the end, die Art, wie wir die Dinge sehen, und Weltanschauung. So, this is Hacker and Schulte's translation. And if you're wondering why all of the lines and stuff, a friend of mine once suggested this is how translators see texts, and I thought it was a very nice way of putting it. So they translate Übersehen as to have an overview, and they miss an opportunity here to use uniform word choice, right? Survey, surveyability, surveyable, and that's an opportunity that translators generally look to exploit to good, because mirroring effect. You want to mirror the source text as much as possible. They omit the second das wir at the end, so right after precisely, it's the understanding which consists in this, that we gets lost. The eben they translate as precisely, following, presumably Anscombe. But this particular translation of eben as precisely is a bit paradoxical, because it's at once overly literal and too passive. The German is much more active, I think, in this particular instance. In the English, understanding consists in something. In the German, we understand something, right? We do something. So the question is, where do we go in the translation? They omit the second des of finding and inventing. They omit the not of finding and of inventing. Zwischenglieder, there's not a particular problem there with their translation. That's just an improvement over Anscombe's. This idea of Darstellung and Darstellungsform, represent, and the way we represent things. This is an instance of Polyptoten. It's a rhetorical figure that uses the repetition of the root of a word. So representation would be an instance of Polyptoten, and we have that here. I think, however, that they use the wrong root, and we'll get into that in a second. And they omit the rhetorical figure of metanoia, which is a disruption in the flow of the text. And the metanoia is how we look at matters, the Art wie wir die Dinge sehen. And here there's some special problems, and we'll be getting into that as well. And as far as the Weltanschauung is concerned, that is really just, there's no special problem. But there is, there is just a special problem that I'm only going to mention here because it would just get way too out of hand for a talk of this length. And it has to do with the cross-pollination of research efforts in Wittgenstein studies and other fields. So let's just get to Übersehen and Co. Sorry, I'm going to take this down a notch. So this is a quote from the Blue Book, where Wittgenstein seems to be trying to translate into English the verb übersehen. He seems to mean that you can take something in at a glance and easily hold it in the mind. And Hacker and Schulte translate this as to have an overview, and it's in section 5 of the investigations, they translate Übersehen as to survey, right? So again, we have this problem of non-uniformity, non-uniform word choice in the translation. And also there's a difference in emphasis. In the German, we fail to act. In the English, we fail to have something. And this is the difference between having and being. It's also a difference that Wittgenstein was presumably familiar with. There was a very famous statement about this particular difference by Karl Kraus in his famous essay, Die Sprache. And Wittgenstein, I don't think, adopts his view completely, but I think he would have been aware of it in that the problems that Kraus talks about crop up here in the translation. And it's very simply this. If I have an overview, or if I survey something, there's a difference of emphasis, and it's very simple to see in the term Land der Dichter und Denker, right? Is it a land that has poets, or is it a land of poets, right? Is it comprised of them, poets and thinkers? And that's the kind of distinction here that's introduced in the translation that I don't think is introduced by Wittgenstein. And if anyone's wondering, I do think Hacker's and Baker's suggestion that Übersehen, Übersichtlich, and so on should be translated with to survey and surveyability is as good a translation as we're going to get. In fact, I think it's just the simple and good translation that I think we should probably stick with. But we can have that conversation another time. Suffice it to say that the orthographic thread is cut in Hacker and Schulte's translation. Overview, surveyability, and surveyable. We've lost the visual link between all the terms that Wittgenstein seems to be, for which Wittgenstein seems to establish a visual link, namely orthographic. So here we have the simple repetition of das Wir und das Wir, the translation of eben and Zwischenglieder. the repetition of das wir und das wir, I think Wittgenstein uses that to a very definite purpose. In the first instance, we fail to do something. In the second instance, we do not fail to do something. And that seems to me to be as good as a juxtaposition as one can hope for, and as clear as a juxtaposition as one can hope for in a philosophical text. This idea of eben, and again, this juxtaposition is lost in their translation, right? In Hacker and Schulte's translation, you just don't see it. You have to actually understand what's going on. And Wittgenstein, I think, went to a lot of trouble to set this up visually for the reader. Anybody who takes their time on his text, it should be obvious to them that you have these two forms that are repeated. And repetition, as we know, is a form of style in writing that can be used to draw attention to certain aspects of the text, and I think this is one of them. This eben bit, Anscombe and Hacker and Schulte both all translated this as precisely, but I think it's more accurately rendered as nichts tun, so it's supposed to do nothing more than. And the reason why I think that's more accurate, because we can get the that we in English again. We can establish the juxtaposition. And we have the idea that this is we're looking at an intertextuality here from Bemerkungen über Fraser's Golden Bough. Wittgenstein also seems to think that at some point or another was one way of viewing this. Zwischenglied, I think, is a metaphor, as far as I can tell, and it seems to be a chain of some sort, a link in a chain, presumably in a chain of reasoning. And that's, I think, illustrated by the quote from Fraser's Golden Bough, where he talks about it's a hypothetical intermediate link. It's not supposed to do anything else than draw one's attention to a similarity, the connection of facts. And he talks about deriving a circle from an ellipsis. The simple repetition of des und des and des Findens und des Erfindens. The reason why I think Zwischenglied is a metaphor has to do with this simple repetition. It's an afterthought. At least the drafting history of this particular passage suggests that it's an afterthought. The handwriting circled in red is Wittgenstein's, and it's the addition des und des Erfindens. And I think the reason why Zwischenglied is a metaphor, and we're supposed to understand it as a metaphor, is because the second des in des Erfindens is intended by Wittgenstein to slow the reader down. And I remember there's some point in one of his, I think it's in Culture and Value, but don't quote me on that. At some point he remarks that he reads very slowly and he wants to be read very slowly. And I think he's done certain things in his text to make us read very slowly. And I think this is one of them. So if we say, hence the importance of finding and inventing intermediate links, it rolls off the tongue too easily. And I don't think that's what Wittgenstein had in mind. I think this is what we would call in German a Stolperstein. It's meant to trip up the reader and to add emphasis. So hence the importance of finding and of inventing Zwischenglieder, and the slowing the reader down is to prepare the reader for the metaphor. At least that's how I understand this particular repetition. So moving on to the Darstellung und Darstellung, Hacker and Schulte translate this here as the way Darstellungsform as the way we represent things, but Wittgenstein uses the term form of representation in the Brown Book, and he uses it in a similar situation to the one to section 122. He says, a state of being able to do something is the form of representation we are most strongly tempted to adopt. Or as one could also put it, we are strongly inclined to see the metaphor of something being in a particular state for saying that something can behave in a particular way. And this way of representation, or this metaphor, is embodied. And so this Darstellungsform business is bezeichnet unsere Darstellungsform, the kind of metaphors we're inclined to use to talk about things. And I don't know why Hacker and Schulte opted to translate this as the way we represent things, which in other contexts could be a perfectly reasonable way to do this. But in this particular instance, I don't think it is. Form of representation, Darstellungsform, is used at section 158 of the investigations, and Hacker and Schulte translate it there as well as form of representation. So again, we have this idea of non-uniform word choice in the translation, which makes it difficult for readers to follow Wittgenstein's thought, in, just at the simple level of terminology. This brings me to the instance of metanoia. Metanoia is a rhetorical figure of disrupting the flow of writing. And it's most clearly used when a writer or a speaker says something and then just says no, and then gives another, and then goes on. Krauss uses this all the time. Does the satirist need this? No. And then he goes on. And that's just a really simple way of a simple illustration of the rhetorical figure of metanoia. And here I think Wittgenstein uses it throughout the investigations. Once you see it, it's hard not to see it everywhere in the investigations. Wittgenstein's imagined interlocutor is, I think, the exact embodiment of the rhetorical figure of metanoia, right? The interlocutor is used by Wittgenstein to interrupt his thought, to get him to slow down, to pivot, to restate or to revisit some kind of some idea that he was just discussing in the investigations. And the quote at the bottom is from Farnsworth. He wrote a wonderful book on classical English rhetoric, and he has this wonderful quote where he says that it creates the impression that the speaker is working out his words, and I think that's part of what the investigations is, right? You have this feeling that it's not quite complete, it's not quite finished. There's always these interpolations, and the drafting history that he's always adding or taking something out. So he's working it out. It just feels right at this point as well. And so sometimes the device is more specifically, is used more specifically to suggest a conflict within the speaker. Different views or impulses are audibly struggling for the mastery. And that somehow just feels right in Wittgenstein's investigations. There's this audible struggle between him and the interlocutor. And this is one of those instances. And I think one way to think about this is in the very simple terms of what we would call in English the moving from Latinate to Saxon words. It's an oversimple and awful distinction, but instructive, I think, in this particular instance. So he moves from Darstellungsform, which is complicated, doesn't quite say what he means, right? He seems to mean metaphor. And then he pivots right away and disrupts the flow of writing and tries to restate what he was trying to say in the first place. So, bezeichnet unser Darstellungsform. You have to read a pause there. Die Art, wie wir die Dinge sehen. There's a disruption. You're forced to stop. If you try to read it, bezeichnet unser Darstellungsform, die Art, wie wir die Dinge sehen, it just doesn't work, right? There's just something there that you've missed that you have to come back to. And with this particular instance of metanoia, it's also what we call an iambic finish. Da dum, da dum, da dum. It's a known finish in English and in German. And the idea is to draw attention to the certain rhythm of the sentence on the one hand, and to get the reader to snap out of what's going on, what happened previously, right? Because we don't have this iambic finish prior to that. Darstellungsform just doesn't give that kind of a finish. So we have this juxtaposition between the terms, Darstellungsform, and then his restatement of it. And I want to just read a little bit of what I wrote here so I don't get it wrong. Hacker and Schulte seem to view Darstellungsform und die Art, wie wir die Dinge sehen, as an identity statement, right? They seem to think that these two things are just, one is a restatement of the other. They're synonyms of sorts. But I think the interpolation of die Art, wie wir die Dinge sehen, I think Wittgenstein is trying to correct himself. I think he's trying to pivot here. I don't think he's trying to say the same thing. I think not the identity between the two statements, but the difference is really the point. Again, the same reason to slow the reader down, right? You should be jolted out of the comfort of reading. And what is more, the idea that different views and impulses are struggling audibly for the mastery feels right due to Wittgenstein's use of an imagined interlocutor, which is also often suggestive of a conflict within Wittgenstein himself. And this just seems to fit this rhetorical figure almost perfectly. And I think in the Hacker and Schulte translation, this just gets all lost, and I can't figure out why you'd want to lose this. Let me put this somewhat differently. Wittgenstein is dissatisfied with the use of Darstellungsform, and he tries to improve on it only in the second part of the sentence, die Art, wie wir die Dinge sehen. And he tries to improve upon it by resulting to a kind of simplicity. And it's the kind of simplicity that we recognize as iambic, da-dum, da-dum, da-dum. But Hacker and Schulte's translation improves on the first part of Wittgenstein's sentence, right? They turn Darstellungsform into the way we represent things. And they do precisely in the first part of the sentence what Wittgenstein does in the second part of the sentence. So where Wittgenstein is trying to simplify things after Darstellungsform, Hacker and Schulte are already simplifying it for us in the choice of translation, the way we represent things. So I think there's a confusion going on in the text that's not, in the translation that's not present in the German. And I also think that their Finnish, how we look at matters, it's not a known Finnish, at least as far as I can tell. It's not iambic, it's not trochaic, for instance. It's not a mix of iambic and trochaic. It reminds me much, it jolts me out of the reading in the way that Goethe's opening scene in Nachts jerks the reader. Habe nun Acht, Philosophie, Juristerei und Medizin, right? The idea is that Goethe writes clunkily there on purpose to make fun of the Romantics. And here we have an instance of someone being serious and writing clunky prose for no reason that I can make, that I can discern. So if we move to Weltanschauung, he penned this part of he adds Weltanschauung in every version of the investigations. And in the earliest versions, he adds Spengler. So he's telling us where to go for this understanding. And you can see, I'll go back for a second. Here you can see Spengler, he crosses out, this is the TS 239, the bearbeitete Frühfassung, and this is where he first deletes or crosses out Spengler from Weltanschauung, from the association with Weltanschauung. There's 2 points that I want to make here. The first is, why am I quoting a letter from Gretel to Ludwig? Well, we know that he gave Gretel a manuscript, presumably of the Urfassung, for Christmas of 1936. And the point, why is this relevant to translation? Well, we don't know if they talked about it. At least I've not been able to find anything that Gretel and Ludwig talked about this manuscript. And which means that sometimes when you're translating information that you would like to have has been lost to posterity for whatever reason. Manuscript gets lost, conversation hasn't been recorded, there's nothing in someone's personal diary or what have you. And the second point I want to make is, if I were to translate the investigations completely, I would go through the trouble of looking at Spengler research in English and in German, trying to get an understanding of 2 points. The first point I would want to understand is Wittgenstein using Weltanschauung actually in the sense of in the same way that Spengler used it? Did he just use it up until 1937, 1938, and then he gave it up and changed ideas of what Weltanschauung meant? And then the second point that I would want to research is how are the Spengler scholars talking about Weltanschauung in English? If indeed they are talking about it in English. And I think that there's some interesting cross-pollination possibilities between Spengler research and Wittgenstein research. We just saw one in the previous talk with the cross-pollination between Schraffer and Wittgenstein. And I think we have another case here, and we just don't know what would come to light. We have no idea. And that would be something any translator, I think, would have to account for. That would have to be you'd have to spend the few months or a few years or however long it takes figuring that out. So what does this all mean? Here's the part where everyone gets angry. Here's my proposed new translation of section 122. I try to retain. Oh, sure. I'll just zoom in on the translation so that we might be able to see. Oh. So I've tried to retain everything that I accuse Hacker and Schulte of omitting. I start with a metaphor with the Hauptquelle as a primary fountain because I think there's just metaphor all over here in this form of Darstellungsform with Zwischenglieder, and I figured, well, why not just start with it? Why not lead with that? But that's a point anyone can take issue with. So let's just go through it. A primary fountain of our failure to understand is that we fail to survey the use of our words. So here, that we and survey, we get the uniform word choice. Surveys, surveyable. And we get the first that we. Our grammar does not lend itself to such surveys. Surveyable representations impart the kind of understanding which consists in nothing more than that we see connections. So we get the, we borrow Eben, our understanding of Eben from Fraser's remarks on the Golden Bough to mean nothing more than that, nothing more than, and by using this phrase, we're able to establish the juxtaposition in exactly the same way, in a mirroring a way that Wittgenstein does. Hence the importance of finding and of inventing intermediate links. That's just a simple addition, of course, right, of inserting the word of. This concept of a surveyable representation is of fundamental significance to us. It characterizes our form of representations, how we see things. Is this a Weltanschauung? So the form of representation, of course, we borrowed from the Brown Book, and we're able to retain the rhetorical figure of Polyptoten by not taking the form of the word represent, a representation as represent, but taking representation as the root of the terms. Surveyable representation is one term, and then the second term is form of representation, and we get the same kind of repetition that I think Wittgenstein uses. And how we see things is so-called, it's not an iambic finish. I tried as much as I could to get an iambic finish in English, and it just doesn't work. So I went for a trochaic finish, which is just the opposite of an iambic finish. A trochaic finish is, to reiterate, iambic finish is the dum, and a trochaic finish is just the opposite, da dum. And it's also a known finish in both languages, so I have to be resourceful here and try to use the same idea that Wittgenstein was trying to convey, and I think trochaic finishes do the same kind of thing that iambic finishes do, or at least they can do the same kinds of things, and I think this is one of those instances. Again, with Weltanschauung, I just left that. I put it in lowercase because I'm American and we don't capitalize the word in the States, although it is capitalized in Great Britain. And there's also one other point to mention, and I figured I'd keep this for the end of the talk. In German, you have another instance of repetition of the root, findens und erfindens, right? The root there is finden. And if you want to ever give an example of something being lost in translation, here it is. In English, you can't repeat the root. You just can't do it. I tried. I even looked through the dictionary again this morning just to make sure that I didn't screw up completely. There's just no two words that mean the same things as finding and inventing that share the root. If anybody can think of one, please feel free to pass it on. But that's an instance where we have to make compromises in rhetorical figures and intertextualities. But I think they're understandable. I think we can forgive the translator for being a traitor in this specific instance. And just so everybody can see, Yeah, okay, so that's just the trochaic finish. I had to make sure that I knew what I put on the slide. So that's my talk. I've come to the end, and thank you very much for listening. Oops.
Thank you very much for this fascinating talk.
I'm trying to